Yeah, I'm so happy to be able to talk about this book, which is very, very close to my heart, and I really, really hope that some of you will read it as well, and it might impact some of you in a similar way to how it did me. Um, so, as Elisa just briefly introduced this book, I'm going to do a very short reading from the second chapter. So, the main character, Jina, she has been assaulted by her ex-partner, who is also her boss at work, and she decided to post it online. And she decided to post it on a film review website, and it got picked up by the press, and so her company has found out about it. And the second chapter is basically Jina has been called into the office of the director of the company, and he is giving a very long monologue to her, and so it goes on for a whole chapter. It's a very interesting chapter, and I'm going to read very briefly from the beginning of this chapter. So the chapter is called "You Need to Grow Up." I know you're upset with us, Jina, but listen to our side of the story for a minute. To be honest, I really don't think I need to justify myself at this point. We're both a laughing stock now that the press has picked it up. But let's be honest, the company looks so bad. We need to be able to plan ahead. Our employees should be able to trust us, to be confident that we'll deal with any issue, whatever it is. You think the company can trust you lot now? Dating, whatever you call it. Why did you have to bring the company into it? Why post it online? You should have come to me. I had no idea. After all, Dinasi, you never look like that kind of girl. You really should have come to me first. What were you thinking? Both your names and the company is out there now, Dinasi. Image is everything for us. We're a travel company. As a director, should I really have to be calling you in for this? Dinasi, do you know how irresponsible you've been? You've done colossal damage to our revenue. You wrote it yourself, that you couldn't trust that the company would handle it properly, and that's why you asked for help online. Do you know how much you've lowered employee morale? You realize the company could hold you legally liable. Why are you so shocked? You didn't know? You're saying you never thought you'd have to take responsibility for something like this? Did you ever once ask for our help? Did we refuse? That's why you posted it online? That wasn't it, was it? When you said you couldn't trust we would handle it properly, you were lying, weren't you? It was a lie. You lied. You know Manager Lee is like a son to me, right? It was me who asked him to take time off. What he did was wrong. Guess I'm a feminist too. I teach our youngest properly. My son's 9, and I always tell him, girls need protecting. If another lad breaks your nose, you go and punch him right back. But girls are a different matter. Our son would never, ever hit a girl, even as a joke. And he doesn't tease them to do a runner. He doesn't tease them, then do a runner, or pull pranks and make them cry. He's a decent kid. But sometimes girls hit him. Young girls are too cocky these days. Our boy is so restrained, the girls think they're winning by their own strength. They chase him and kick him, punch him in the stomach. It's unbelievable. They seem to get some kind of joy out of beating up the boys. They've got no idea my lad is just letting them off the hook. If you ask me, their parents need to get their acts together. Boy, girl, what does it matter? Isn't it the punching that's the issue? If a girl takes a swing at a boy, she needs a bollocking. We tell lads to control their anger, just in case they don't know their own strength and end up causing proper harm. But letting girls run around punching and kicking whoever they like, does that make any sense to you? Those kind of girls, they're unattractive. I can't speak when it comes to you, but those girls, they act up to get the lads' attention. Either that, or they just really hate losing. I've worked a good number of years now, and girls like that grow up exactly the same. They don't listen, they're obstinate, they're unattractive. I don't want to generalize, but those kind of girls, their faces are stuck like that forever. The lads are just the same. There are always the ones that don't listen to a word you say, no manners. They think they've come this far because they're God's gift or something. They're so arrogant. Men shouldn't be able to get away with it. I've gotten off topic, but what I'm trying to say is, I'm on your side, Jinasi.
Is it working? Thank you so much for reading this passage. I think we all agree that it's very gripping from the start, almost triggering, I will say. And we all have different opinions on these first chapters. I was very interested in asking you, Claire, or you will describe the book, the novel. Can you give us, for example, 3 words and tell us why you choose those words to describe the novel, please?
Yes, of course. So the 3 words that came to mind for me were firstly necessary. And I say necessary because I really wish that I had been able to read this book when I was much younger, before it's almost like something like a survival guide or something that I wasn't able to put into words, but I read this book. And so much of my past experiences and the people around me were just captured so well. And I feel like if I had read this book before, when I was younger, before I went to university, I would have been able to stand up for the people around me, stand up for the women around me, to be able to put these experiences into words. And so I think it's so important for everyone to read books like this that force us to confront ourselves and confront our complicity in all of these things, sexual violence in particular. And the next word, the second word that I would use to describe this book is haunting, because these characters have never left me. Having translated the book, I've read it many times, but even the first time I read it, the character just stayed with me. And that is also to do with Kangwage's writing style, because she writes Gothic fiction. And she's inspired by the likes of the Bronte sisters and Shirley Jackson, all these very important Gothic writers. But her writing really truly is haunting. And the third word that I would use to describe this book is jarring. And this may not immediately be a word that you think of in praising a book, but I think that it's a perfect way to describe it. The perspective shifts in the book in and of themselves are jarring. And I think she uses this to make us constantly uncomfortable and constantly doubt ourselves, and to bring out that feeling of almost like it's like a gaslight. The book is gaslighting you in a way, because it leads you in one direction and then you suddenly shift into someone else's perspective. And I think this is just a really incredible, effective tool that she uses to mimic that feeling of the complexity around these issues, and how it's not a straightforward case of there's a victim and there's a perpetrator, because there's so much complicity involved, and we are forced to confront ourselves in that aspect of it as well.
Interesting. While giving these 3 words, you mentioned haunting. It makes me think about the 5th question that I've got here. And it's that recently a fellow reader online said, as I mentioned before, that some passages were very triggering. And I think it also speaks for like the way the characters haunt the readers while you are reading the book, but also after you finished it. After I finished it, I closed the book and I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So I think my question will be, how did you mentally cope with translating such heavy passages? And how was it moving from this translation, this story, this heavy story, to another? What did you do? Can you give us some information about that?
Yeah, I would say that I think the important thing to highlight about this book is that it is not trauma porn. It is talking about traumatic experiences, but it's not done in the same way as this sexual violence is dealt with in a lot of literature. And by that I mean, Kang Wagil doesn't pick up this issue and then drop it again. She sees it through to the end. And so although these issues will be triggering to us, and triggering in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, we talk about trigger warnings and content warnings, and I think that's really important, but it's why these issues are being brought up. We need to be careful that we don't avoid them entirely, and we deal with them in the right way. And Kang Wagil really takes us through that process. She goes through, right? She deals with all of the issues and unpacks all of it. So actually, rather than these, us being triggered and then not knowing what to do with that feeling, we have something to do with it because we're going through a journey of a book. And I think that's why literature like this is so powerful, because reading a book takes, a number of hours and a number of touch pens you will be doing over a series of days or weeks or months or however long it takes you to read a book. And so we're going on a journey with these characters. So it's not like a brief interaction. It's not like we're seeing a news article or we're seeing like a video, like a reel on Instagram. And so these issues come really quickly and then we don't get to really deal with them. Actually, in the process of going through a book, it's like a personal journey as well. We can't speak back to the writer. We can't interact with it, so we can't get defensive. We have to unless we drop the book entirely, we have to confront ourselves, and that's what Kang Wagil really helps us to do through this process. And there's a really interesting chapter in the book where basically one of the main female protagonists, she's talking about her own experience of reading literature that brings up these issues. Basically literature that uses this trauma porn, and she talks about the rage that it brings up in her. And I think it's such a powerful chapter because I think it's such a real reflection of how often these issues are dealt with. We see trauma dealt with in a terrible way in so much media. And so rather than turn away from these issues, we need to face them in similar ways to how Kang Wagil does here.
So next, you spoke about journey. I will speak about like an outside journey, your personal journey with the translation of this book. I would like to ask you about the process. How did you start translating the book? Did someone suggest to translate it, or did you personally submit a pitch for that book? Can you give us more information about that?
Yeah, of course. So for those of you who don't know how what being a literary translator involves, basically, to put it very simply, a literary translator is basically operating as an agent who doesn't get paid to be an agent. So you are finding works that you love, and then you are pitching them to English language publishers a lot of the time. And obviously you're not an agent, so you don't get a commission. So it's how it often is. It's, I think, hopefully changing a bit with more collaboration between literary translators and agents and publishers. But I still do it. And that's because of authors who I'm really passionate about. So I first read Kang Wagil's work when I read her short story Umbok, which was critically a story, I think, probably her most critically acclaimed short story in Korea. And I was really interested in it because it was a Gothic story, and because I found out about her Gothic influences within, writers like the Bronte sisters, as I mentioned, and all sorts of, writers who I'd read myself, and it was really interesting that she had these influences. And I was like, okay, that drew me in, and the feminist message of her writings. And so I was like, oh, I'm really interested to read her novel, and I read this novel. And I worked on a pitch with Anton Her, who was my mentor, the National Centre for Writing Emerging Translators Mentorship Program. And so we worked on a pitch together, and it was actually from a cold pitch. I sent an email to Pushkin Press. Another translator, Daniel Hahn, gave me an email address, someone there. I emailed them. He actually didn't know their email address, but he guessed it. He was like, well, her first name is this, so probably this. And I emailed her, and she actually emailed me basically straight back and was like, oh, I'm really interested in this book. Can you tell me more? And it doesn't happen very often. So it was very, it felt like, perfect timing, and they acquired the book. And this is quite unusual because I hadn't really pitched it much, but I think it's also a testament to the power of this novel, and I think the timeliness of this novel as well. So that was there was some difficulties along the way. Actually, this novel was pitched by another translator, Matto Mandeslut, like the year before, and he pitched it to another publisher who wanted to buy the book, but the Korean publisher was basically ghosted this English language publisher. So it would have, this already had interest from another publisher, and there were difficulties with this book as well, because getting the very small Korean publisher with very limited staff, and it wasn't their priority. But thankfully, thanks to the help of an agent in Korea, they managed to get the communication going. But the book almost didn't happen. It didn't happen once, and it almost didn't happen again. So there are a lot of obstacles that can come in the way. Thankfully, it happened, and I'm really so happy that Pushkin Press decided to publish it.
Lucky us.
Yes.
You were mentioning your fellow translator, Matto Mandeslut. I read in an interview online that you often swap your translation with other translators. I think this is a very interesting way of proceeding to translating a book. I was wondering, as Matto also pitched the book, did you speak with him about translating this novel? Did you exchange your views on the writer's writing style? Did you learn from each other? How was the fact that he was also on the thing for translating?
So specifically with this case, I spoke with Matto about this novel and asked what he was doing with it, and since nothing happened because of the Korean publisher, he's a translator from Dutch, so he was very busy with lots of other projects. So actually he kindly put me in touch with the author, and I talked to her and I asked about translating her book, and I didn't actually talk to Matto in a great deal, to be honest, about this particular book, but we were on the same translation program at the Literature Translation Institute of Korea, where we did lots of workshopping. But translation swapping, I think, is an essential part of being a good translator. It's, writers do it with workshop, right? We constantly get feedback and criticism on our work, and that's how we improve. Translation can be a very solitary profession, but it's really important that as translators, writers, freelancers, anyone, creators working on their own, we seek out community. When I have any translation, even though it says translated by Clare Richards, every time it's a collaborative work. It's thanks to the feedback I got from other translators. So it's thanks to Anton. This is also Anton's translation in a way, and it's also the feedback I got from another very dear friend and colleague, Savad Hussein. She read through the whole book and gave me feedback. But this is what we do as translators. We help. I think the translation community is one of the most generous communities that I've come across, and it's really, I think it's really easy to isolate ourselves, and it's really difficult because we want, if we're on our own, then it's hard to celebrate the successes of other translators. But if we're all part of a community, then we can be really happy for other people when they get books and when successes come their way. We can also just constantly improve ourselves as translators too. And there are all sorts of communities out there. But yeah, every time I do a translation, I'm always getting feedback from people because I always want to do better.
Are you having feedback from translators who are also translating Korean to English, as you mentioned, Anton, or are you also asking for translators more specifically, who are also translating from another language, just to have an overall, I will say, opinion of like how the translation reads or something like that?
Yeah, both. It's great to have as much feedback as you can. It's ideal to have feedback both from someone who speaks Korean and someone who doesn't, because someone who speaks Korean will inherently understand some nuances that someone who's not as familiar with the culture might not understand. So it's helpful for someone else who's not as familiar to read it, and when there are parts which aren't immediately obvious, they might ask, and maybe you could add a gloss there, or something you haven't thought about. So and the more eyes the better, but definitely it's good to have a mix of both Korean speakers, non-Korean speakers. It really helps the quality of my translations.
I mentioned, I think, at the beginning of this conversation that you already translated another short piece by Kang Hwa-gin called The Lake. It's very nice. I recommend it. Very good. I would like to know if there was any particularities about translating another person from translating The Lake, or was it a similar feeling? And another question will be how translating another person was different from translating other translation you did, for example, like a Barbie by Park Min-jung, or for example, Beyond the Story by BTS. I suppose there are like many differences.
I think when you're translating anything, it's about, the key thing is inhabiting the voice, and that's something that is difficult to put your finger on exactly how you do that. But I think once you have the more you translate one author, the more you can inhabit their voice. And so therefore translating The Lake was very interesting because there's differences, but the themes are very, very similar. And so I felt it was a continuation of inhabiting that very similar voice. And how that's one of the most difficult things to do. You can translate a sentence accurately, but how do you mimic that voice when you come across? It's not a one-to-one thing. And I think it's really about just getting in the mindset of the novel and allowing yourself a bit of distance from the original sentence structure, and how thinking about actually carrying across that atmospheres. And that's not necessarily about translating the sentence as accurately as possible. It's bringing out that feeling that you have from the source text. It's very different from translating something like BTS Beyond the Story.
I can imagine.
Yeah, in BTS Beyond the Story, we were actually our aim was to do almost the opposite. We wanted to keep as close as possible to the original source structure because we knew that was what army would really appreciate. And so we're thinking of most about our target audience and respecting them. You know, they want to know as close as possible what the BTS members are saying in Korean. And so trying to keep that as close as possible. So you might have, you know, sentences that sound quite awkward in English, but that's not because, you know, that's because that's what we wanted. We wanted it to sound like that. So it was very different. Also, that's the non-fiction. It's you know, it's a very different type of translation. So that was a really interesting experience. And the our motivations and our decisions that we made were based on respecting our audience in that case.
So in the recent years, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we've seen like a Korean wave coming to like the Western countries, Europe. I think this is what we call Hallyu wave, if I'm not wrong. So we can see like a lot of people, readers, in general, like watching K-dramas, Korean cinema. And so there's been like a lot of mainstream stereotypes propagated by people online. I was wondering, do you think that translating such novels like Another Person, or I was also thinking about, for example, Love in the Big City by Park Sang-young, translated by Anton He, or for example, Walking Practice by Do Kim-in, translated by Victoria Kodo. Do you think that translating such novels bring another perspective of Korea and sort of like introduce people to the reality of what it's like to be in Korea nowadays?
Yeah. I think I would respond to that by saying that I think there is room for both the real and the romanticized. And I think it's important to have access to both. And I don't want to discount the importance of having escapism and these romanticized image, as long as we know that they are romanticized image. You know, we don't, a lot of the times we're watching K-dramas because we want to escape. We want to imagine that romanticized, or we know it's not real, but we're still watching it and we're enjoying it, and there's a real place for that. And I think the majority of, I'm sure there are some people who watch that and then go to Korea and think it's going to be like that and they're going to have their fairy tale, I'm sure there are a few, but I don't think that's the majority. And there's a real place for that, but it's important to have both perspectives. And I think, there's really interesting books, as you mentioned, like Walking Practice, Love in the Big City. I think with Another Person, there are, of course, Korean elements, cultural elements to novel, but I think actually what makes this novel so haunting, powerful, is that it could be anywhere. This could happen here. It's, of course, set in Korea, but it feels so real and so relevant to my own experience of university, despite, there's some specifics that are slightly different, but it feels like you could just carry it over across and do it, in a slightly different, slightly altered, set it in the UK, and it wouldn't be strange at all. And so it's not a Korea specific issue, as we all know. And I think it's important. I think that's very important about this novel, because you don't want a novel to come along and be like, oh, isn't it terrible for women in Korea? You don't read that novel and think that. You think, wow, it's just terrible for women in many places. It's terrible. But we also need to remember that it's not just terrible for women. Patriarchy is terrible for men too, even though there are certain privileges that come with it. Dismantling patriarchy is great for everyone. And Yeah, I would also say about, I think where the kind of romanticized image of Korea, where it's important, I think where it can become dangerous, or if we have this kind of romanticized image of K-pop stars, is when that power is abused. I mean, you can think of I don't know whether people know much about what happened with Burning Sun. Basically, this club run by ex-member of Big Bang called Sungni, and I won't share the details of it, but there's actually a documentary on the BBC about it if you wanted to know more. But where behind these facades is something, it's abuse of power, abuse of people. And so that's why I think it's really important to have this balanced perspective and know what goes on behind the surface as well. Enjoy those romanticized images, but know that they're not real, and also educate ourselves about what is actually going on at the same time.
I was speaking also with like a reader just before, and she was saying that introducing these kind of books also made people aware when we talk about feminism that it's not just white feminism, it's also feminism for Black women, for Asian women, for gay people as well, for everyone. And I think, yeah, I really agree with you that it's very important to introduce this kind of narratives to make sure that people are aware that it's not just a white problem. My next question is much lighter than that. We recently got the news that you translated a new novel that will come out quite soon, that it's called The Healing Season of Pottery by Yeon So-min. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So it's a very different novel. It's within what's called the healing genre. You may have seen lots of these books translated from Korean and Japanese and some other languages. For example, Welcome to the Hyunandong Bookshop by Hwang Borum, translated by Shanatan. So this is, it's been quite popular lately. And it's basically a novel about the female protagonist called Jongmin, who has been working really long hours in her job, and she's just burnt out, and she's pushed herself too far, and she one day just stands up and is like, no, I'm leaving, I'm not doing this anymore, and leaves her job, and she locks herself up at home for a few months and doesn't go anywhere in her flat. Actually, that happens in another person as well. And at some point, she realizes that she can't do this forever, and she walks outside. It's really, really hot. She's walking around. She doesn't know where she's going, and she's just like, well, I really need a drink. So she walks into what she thinks is a cafe, but it turns out to be a pottery studio. And the owner of the pottery studio, who's just this wonderful, charming character, she convinces Tongmin to sign up for pottery classes. And it's about the people she meets there and their stories in a similar way to the Hyunandong Bookshop. And we get to see the relationship she builds with them, and also just how she basically manages to find her way back to herself through these people and through the pottery. And there are some like darker elements of it when she's talking about her past and she's dealing with the things that she's gone through. But it's just a very heartwarming novel. So it was a real pleasure to translate, and I have since started pottery classes myself. And I would like to challenge you to read the book and not start pottery classes afterwards. Yeah, so it's really it's a really nice book.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. Honestly, mark your calendar. That's my last question. Actually, I'm interested in what you're currently reading. Can you give us one recommendation of a Korean novel that you read recently, and another one from any other author that really inspired you or that you really, really liked?
Yes, of course. I think the best Korean novel that I have read recently is by a writer called Im Sora. I have worked on her short stories before, and I have utmost respect for her as a writer. And her new novel came out at the end of last year. It's the title is I Say I Am There. It's a quote from an Adrienne Rich poem. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, actually, but it's a story about four women who are brought together by an art exhibition, and it's the stories that each of these women have are so interesting, and she has these characters that are they're kind of always looking from the outside in. They see the world in a different way, and they're trying to comprehend the absurdities and the contradictions in the world around them. And it's just so interesting. And she's also an activist, and she talks about a lot of social issues. Her short stories are fascinating. I mean, she writes about like housing scams and working in a laboratory of fruit flies and like all these kind of things that they're so hyper realist. These things that you would never think about writing a story about. It's not just writing about housing scams. She writes about it in complete detail as well, so you know exactly how these things work and these very specific systems that are in place. And I've never seen anyone write novels about things like this, and it's really fascinating. And yeah, she also writes about disability in a really nuanced way. And yeah, she's great. So I really hope that I will be able to translate her work, more of her works. And yes, I've read lots of good books recently, but I wanted to mention this book because I think is a quite interesting tie-in with Kangwagyo, because I follow Kangwagyo on Instagram, and I actually find a lot of my books to read in English because of her recommendations. So she'll read the translation into Korean, and I'll be like, oh, I haven't read that book. So then I read it in English. So there's also a Pushkin Press book, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, by Disha Filyo. I listened to the audiobook, actually. I would encourage you to listen to the audiobook if that's your thing, because it was beautifully narrated as well. And just, it's a short story collection, and all the protagonists are Black women who have a connection to the church in some way, but they're rebelling in their own different ways. And it's just so well written, and the voice in those stories is so strong, and it just really stayed with me. And yeah, so basically most of my favorite books often come from Kangwagyo reading them, and I'm just like, why? How has she managed to get there before me? But she always does. And she reads so much and so widely. Yes, Secret Lives of Church Ladies is a great one, and you can get it from Pushkin Press too. So.
Thank you, Pushkin. Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
I was actually interested to ask you a question as well, because I'm sure that lots of people will be really interested in what you do, and there may be some budding online book reviewers out there, or online or here. And I was wondering what motivated you to start, your Instagram account, reviewing all these books. And I think it's people like you who are so important, particularly for translated literature. And they're just people out here really support these books that don't necessarily get as much attention as they deserve, but it's thanks to people like you who are really supporting these important novels. And I was wondering what motivated you to start it, and also, do you have any advice for any budding book bloggers, reviewers out there too?
I started mostly because I thought I was boring all of my friends on social media with like talking about books and my favorite celebrities. And also I opened like an account on my own just to share about what I love. And yeah, for the most part, it's like a very slow journey. It's about like just being very curious about what you're reading, about like the people you are exchanging online, making friends as well. And and also being able to actually like meet people like you, like translators or people from the literary industry, just to like find a bridge and be able to discuss the themes that were brought up in those novels. It's also, I think, a very nice opportunity to actually be critical and not being too narrow-minded, being able to like hear about what people are saying. And I think this is something that is very important in all social contexts, like nowadays. So yeah, I just like took little photographs, pretty one, hopefully, and like to exchange with people in general. So it's like just a nice community, just a safe space to meet people, and yeah, nothing very special about it, apart from like the friends you make. But I would very much recommend it. There isn't like a specific recipe about like blogging and writing about the things you love. It's just be passionate, be curious, read stuff that you wouldn't necessarily read normally, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you, and thank you so much for supporting this book and for agreeing to this talk.
Thank you
It's been
for
great.
translating it. I wouldn't be here without you. So, so that was my final question and our final point. We will open the ground for people that wants to ask questions. So feel free to do so. We also have like online viewers. So if you want to put questions online, and I'm sure that Claire will be happy to answer them. That being said, thank you to those online viewers who are here with us. It's very important to us that we have the in-person audience, but also you from afar who took the time to listen to us. So yeah, feel free to ask your question, and Claire will be happy to respond, I'm sure. Don't be shy.
Hello. Hi. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to tell us more.
I can hear you, don't worry.
So interesting to hear about the process and challenges. I actually work in publishing, and I'm a Korea and Korean fashion analyst. So it's kind of perfect for me to hear the story about translation. What I'm really interested in when you're translating this book, the legal nuance that is possibly translated to English from honorifics to vocabulary, just different nuance. Was there a moment when translating this book when you're like, oh, I wish I had a footnote. I wish I could add a little bit more context for someone who could have not speak Korean?
Yeah. I don't know. It's hard. I think there's always a way to translate any. I think it's stopped working. Yeah, there's always a way to. It's all about context. I think it's really difficult. If I just were to have to translate one sentence on its own and there was no context for it, the meaning would not come across. But I think, especially when you have the space of a novel, you're able to bring these concepts in and gradually familiarize the reader with what's going on, and they can pick it up through the context. So, for example, in this novel, hierarchy and status difference is a very important thing in this novel. So, use of honorific terms like suffixes like shi and 선배 and 후배, and Pushkin Press are really supportive in keeping these terms in, because I know sometimes there's want to more kind of domesticize these terms. But I think the reason that it worked in here is it's consistent throughout the novel. So even if you're never heard this word before, you'll hear it repeated again and again. And I always think back to reading A Clockwork Orange and all these Russian terms in it. And at the beginning, you're like, what is going on? But you learn the meaning of these words throughout the novel because they're repeated over and over and over again. And you can pick it up from the nuance and the context. And I think it really depends on the particular circumstance. If, you know, that word only appeared once in an entire novel, probably would consider doing something different. But I think it's really nice. It's because it was such an important, that hierarchy and those power imbalances are really important in this novel. So that's why I wanted to carry it across. I think there's probably one or two words in a case where it wasn't repeated, where I was, rather than add a footnote, you add a gloss. So you add a little explanation subtly in there, and that's what. Because we try to avoid adding footnotes where possible. It really depends on the book. If there's a lot, I think if it's a more historical novel, for example, sometimes just adding the gloss is just not enough, and people do add footnotes. But in this case, yeah, managed to avoid the footnotes. But there's definitely one or two times where it's more challenging. But I think there's always a way that you're never going to have, no reader is ever going to have the same experience of any novel. Even if you're reading a novel in English, there's probably a lot of context that you might not know the other person knows. And so you're always going to have a different experience. And of course, if you have a better understanding of culture, you're going to have a better understanding of the novel. But I don't think that's necessarily so different from reading a book in English either.
Hello?
I can hear you.
My question is, does it sell it on Amazon?
Yes, I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Like some men, that some men in general abuse women and did not eat women. That's why it felt that women, like civil rights, and you deserve to have freedom. And for example, if you want to go out and work, and like some girls can get murdered by men in general, and it's very scary for them. That's why this book is very interesting.
Yes, really important issues. And I would encourage you to buy from your local bookshop, bookshop.org rather than Amazon, just so no one's misunderstanding me. But yeah, it's widely available, yes. I can hear you, don't worry.
So I've got two questions. First one is if you could talk a bit about like why you became a translator, why you chose Korean language and that kind of journey. I don't know if you could talk about that, and what you do differently. And then I think you did mention about some of the challenges you might have faced, like being a translator, but what was the most challenging thing to translate this particular book? It's like a third question I'm going to ask, but like, and the process of maybe speaking to the company, do you have a lot of shadow method? Do you have a lot of back and forth?
I might ask you to remind me again in a minute. Okay, so first, I've already forgotten the first question. Sorry. Yes. Yes. It's a long story. I won't give you the whole story. I'll give you a brief one. I was drawn to learning Korean for just very nerdy reason. I love grammar. I know not many people say that, but I was just really drawn to Korean and Japanese because the grammar is completely different from English. I love patterns. English has a lot of exceptions. Every language has grammatical exceptions, but English and French, even I feel like French is even worse, but I'm just being biased because I'm trying to learn French at the moment. Korean and Japanese, I found the grammatical structure very satisfying because things follow rules more, and I like rules. And I like when I can predict things. So it's just, and I was drawn to. Always loved learning languages, and I was just drawn to learning a language that's just completely different from English. And it was really hard, but that just, and then long story short, I was working here actually, and it wasn't easy. I was struggling. As I saw sure, yes, Sujong understands. And I found out about the Literature Translation Institute of Korea and that they have a funded program to train translators. I found out about that, and I was like, wow, this, I never thought about being a literary translator, but I saw this, I was like, this sounds perfect for me. I don't need to work with people. I can work on my own, and doing something I really enjoy. And I love books and I love languages. And so, and I had no idea that such a thing existed as a literature translation institute, but I found out from my colleague here who encouraged me to apply. And I was like, oh, I'd never actually, I'd read Korean literature, but only in translation. And they have this amazing library here of Korean language books. And I started reading a few books in Korean, and it wasn't easy at first. But yeah, and then I applied, and then I did the mentorship with Anton as well. And yes, and what was the second question? Sorry. Oh yeah, I do remember. I actually remember the third question. The most still working. Oh yes, it's good enough. Oh, I remember now. I was told before you're meant to hold the mic like this. Okay, not working at all. Okay. The most challenging thing, I don't know. Nothing immediately comes to mind because Hwangil is such a precise and her writing is so, every sentence is so well put together, and there wasn't really, I didn't, have, it wasn't, when you have a writer who's not as meticulous and doesn't write as well as Kang Hwangil, you have to spend a lot of time trying to work out what on earth they're trying to say because the sentence isn't very well written. But there were literally, it's just such a pleasure to translate such high quality writing because you can just focus on actually doing the translation rather than trying to compensate for bad writing. So, of course, there were challenges in the novel. I think there's a chapter where there's a lot of brackets, and that was quite. I think that was probably I had a lot of back and forth with Savad, who read the book for me, talking about that chapter about how we can make that work because it was a little bit easier in how it was done in the Korean was slightly different, and we had to change it a bit to make it work. So that was one example. And for the last question, to be honest, I didn't have much back and forth with Kang Hwangil because her writing is so clear, it's so excellently written that there was like a couple of things where I was clarifying very, very minor things. But yeah, it was so, I could just go ahead on my own and there wasn't, I think she just trusted translator to do their thing, which is great, because I know it can be different in different language combinations as well. If you have an author who's really proficient in English, sometimes they want to read your entire translation, and that can be an amazing thing to have that feedback, but it can also be like way more time consuming. And if you're not on the same page as the author, there can be conflict. And all the writers I translated from Korean have, they're mostly they don't they trust the translator, and they also don't speak English much, to be honest. So even if they wanted to, they're like, it's just that's you do the English, and I'll trust you in that. But they've all the writers I've worked with have been really generous if there's any questions that I have, and Kangwoo was just great. She just let me go ahead, so that was really nice. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Who was first? Okay.
So I go first. So I just speak kind of like curious about what's the engagement process difference between you working with the author and the celebrities. Do you get kind of like, more engaged, or kind of meeting them and know them more, things like that? Thank you.
By celebrities. Yeah. We didn't talk to BTS, so sadly, that would have been nice. No, we only communicated with the American publisher, and the American publisher were talking with BTS's management company, but BTS weren't themselves weren't. I don't think. So basically, the book was written in Korean, and they had the interviews with the writer, and then it was basically with the writer of the book, and it was talking to their management company Hybe, and then their management company. So thankfully, we didn't have to get involved with the management company. We're just dealing with the American publisher. So I don't know if I don't really have any experience working with celebrities, sadly. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And that book was a very unique case, actually. Done a very short time frame as well. So there had to be like a very efficient line of communication in that case. Yeah. And also, it was Anton who was talking to the American publisher. So actually, he was kind of protecting us from a lot of things. So that was, I was very thankful to have him there. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi.
I can hear you.
I note that Anton his novel is coming out in the UK, I think this week. And I wondered if you also write your own original work as well, or if that's something that I would imagine surrounding yourself with such amazing literature every day might inspire you, or what you might think about that.
Yeah. People do ask me this question, and I always I think the reason I really like translation is that I really like writing beautiful sentences, but I'm really bad at making stuff up. So I think about it. I'm like, maybe I could one day. I do have written a few like non-fiction essays, like personal essays that have been published, but I have never done any fiction. Maybe it would be a good challenge for myself one day. I don't know if I am creative, but I feel like I can be creative when I'm given materials to work with. Coming up with something out of nothing I'm the kind of person who likes to follow a recipe to create something. I like to crochet, but I like to follow a pattern. So I like to be creative within some guidelines, and yeah, I think that's why translation is perfect for me. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I could kind of spoil asking a question, but I think coming from the marketing department, we don't get to stick with the text as much as the editing team do. And I actually read another person since the book came out last year. And the one thing that I wanted to talk about and just hear from your perspective of how uncompromising was about another person and the actual words mentioned in the book, especially in Sujan's perspective, where she makes this comment to Jina saying, "I'm not a woman," and she kind of just left with that sentence. And then you come across it again later on when Sujan says she decides to get revenge on what happened to her and the assault that she went through. And she decides, looking at her assault, the person who assaulted her, looking at him and deciding, I'm going to become a man and I'm going to become another person. And that's when the title gets mentioned in the book. And I just thought it's quite interesting that her way of getting revenge is becoming a man to basically one up on what happened to her. And I thought that is an interesting way of dealing with the sexual violence and the assault that this specific person dealt with. And I wonder I don't necessarily think it's an answer. I just thought it was very interesting that that's presented through such a perspective in particular. What you thought of that and kind of what you thought you wanted us to get out from that.
Yeah, it's that part is, yeah, thanks for mentioning that part. That part is, it's really, really interesting. I think it really highlights the nuance and complexity with which Kang Hwa-gil is presenting these issues again, right? It's, the way that Sujin deals with it instead of, because of the situation that she's in, and she's unable to actually get justice through going to the university or going to whatever. She doesn't feel that she'll be able to get justice that way, so she decides to enact it herself. And then so she has this, that whole chapter is really interesting when she talks about I'm gonna be a man, which basically means that I'm going to take the power back for myself. And basically, and she is also then becoming complicit in her own way as well. And I think that's really, I don't know, you as a reader, you totally understand why she is doing that, but at the same time, you also know that she is a perpetrator herself. And I think it's that complexity as well, and the nuance that's dealt with in the book, and that's one really good example of it.
Do we have any more questions before we wrap up? Do we have any question online?
There was a question that was
already asked. Okay. So I will wrap up this conversation. Thank you again so much, everyone, for coming here today and listening to us, especially to Claire. Thank you, Claire, for speaking to us about another person. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you also to Pushkin Press for organizing the event, and to the Korean Cultural Center for organizing the whole thing.